For years, the old Haida House in Gainesville, Texas, stood as a mysterious relic of the past. Nestled at the edge of town, its weathered stone façade gave off an eerie charm, drawing the curious and the brave to its gates. However, those who ventured too close often came back with stories they couldn't explain. It began with whispers among the locals, rumors that the house had been abandoned for decades, yet lights could be seen flickering at odd hours, and shadows moved across the windows. But the most chilling tales revolved around the eerie phenomena that occurred inside. One particularly haunting night, a group of thrill-seekers decided to spend the night in the infamous Haida House. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they entered the house, its doors creaking open as if expecting them. The air inside felt thick, heavy with an unknown presence. They set up cameras and recording devices, hoping to catch evidence of the paranormal. First, everything seemed still. They explored the creaky floors and dimly lit hallways, laughing nervously at every creak of the old house. But then, without warning, the atmosphere changed. A cold draft swept through the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut in the distance. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered. The group froze. They turned to the door they had just passed through moments before. It was now ajar, swinging slightly as though pushed by an unseen force. A soft whisper echoed through the house, growing louder until it was unmistakable. "I'm still here." The voice wasn't clear, but it sent chills down their spines. They tried to leave, but the door they had just entered through was now locked. Panicking, they scrambled to find another way out, but the house seemed to shift, growing labyrinthine and impossible to escape. Suddenly, they saw it. In the dim light of their flashlight, the figure of a woman appeared at the top of the staircase, her face pale, her eyes hollow, and her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't say a word but simply stared down at them, her presence suffocating. As they turned to flee, the house itself seemed to fight against them. Doors that had been open slammed shut. Windows rattled as though pushed by invisible hands. Desperation set in as they realized they were trapped, each of them feeling an icy grip at their ankles, pulling them back toward the staircase where the ghostly woman stood. With heart-pounding fear, they managed to escape, running out of the house and into the cold night. They never returned. To this day, no one knows who the spirit of Haida House truly is. Some say she is the vengeful ghost of a woman wronged in life, trapped in the house for eternity. Others believe she is simply one of the many spirits that have been drawn to the house, their souls lost in the walls of this eerie mansion. One thing is certain: the strange occurrences continue to this day. The house stands as a grim reminder that some spirits may never rest, forever waiting in the dark, behind the creaking doors and the ghostly whispers of Haida House. As the years passed, the legend of Haida House only grew. The house, though abandoned, never seemed to fully decay. In fact, it was as if the building itself was somehow preserved. Doors that should have rotted remained intact, and windows that should have shattered with time stayed whole. Locals began to notice strange lights flickering in the windows at night, but no one ever dared approach. The house seemed to call to those who sought its secrets, its allure too strong for some to resist. One cold fall evening, a group of paranormal investigators, eager to uncover the truth, arrived in Gainesville. They had heard the stories, seen the rumors circulating online, and were determined to capture undeniable proof of the house's haunted nature. Armed with the latest equipment, infrared cameras, EVP recorders, and motion detectors, they prepared for what they expected to be a night of spine-chilling discoveries. As they entered, the atmosphere inside the house felt different from what they had imagined. There was no immediate sense of foreboding, no heavy presence of malevolence, just an unsettling stillness that seemed to hang in the air. The house was colder than it should have been, but that was not unusual for old, abandoned buildings. They moved through the dark hallways, the creak of floorboards echoing beneath their feet. They set up their equipment in the central parlor, where strange sounds had often been reported. As the team worked, they noticed an odd sensation creeping over them, a feeling that they were being watched, as if the house itself were aware of their presence. One of the investigators, a woman named Claire, reported hearing a faint tapping sound, coming from behind one of the walls. "This doesn't feel right," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. It's like there's something in the walls, something trapped. Ignoring the creeping sense of unease, the team continued with their investigation. It wasn't long before the first recorded anomaly occurred. Their EVP recorder picked up a voice low and barely audible at first, but unmistakably clear when played back. "I never left." The voice sent a ripple of fear through the group. They checked their equipment to make sure there was no interference, no technical glitches. Everything was in working order. They continued to explore, hoping to uncover more. As the night wore on, the house seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening. At one point, one of the investigators, a man named Ethan, was standing in front of an old mirror in the hallway, trying to capture any odd reflections on camera. Suddenly, he felt a cold hand press against his shoulder. He spun around, nothing, but the air was thick, heavy with the oppressive presence of something unseen. "Did you feel that?" Ethan asked, his voice shaky. The team gathered around, and they all felt it then, the unmistakable feeling that the house had shifted. The walls seemed to press in, and the temperature dropped to near freezing. The floor beneath their feet seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like a heartbeat. Suddenly, the motion detectors went off, flashing wildly. One of the cameras began to glitch, flickering in and out of focus. The team turned to face the staircase again. The figure of a woman stood at the top, her white, ghostly form visible even in the dim light. But this time she was not still. She was moving toward them, slowly, each step deliberate, as though she were drawn to the investigators like a magnet. "She's coming closer," Claire whispered, backing away. But the house wouldn't allow her to move freely. The door they had entered through was now inexplicably locked, the handle twisting violently as if someone or something on the other side was trying to force it open. The woman's figure grew more distinct as she descended the stairs, her face still a blur, though her eyes were now visible black pits of emptiness, staring into their souls. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing from every corner of the house. "I never left." The temperature dropped even further, the air growing so cold that their breath became visible in the dim light. The walls around them began to tremble, and the floorboards groaned as though the house itself was awakening. A distant crash echoed from the kitchen, followed by what sounded like footsteps running across the upper floors. Panicked, the investigators scrambled, trying to find a way out. But as they moved toward the back door, it too slammed shut, trapping them in the heart of the house. The lights flickered out entirely, and the team was plunged into total darkness, the only sounds their breathing and the ever-closer footsteps of the entity that was stalking them. Claire's flashlight flickered on again, and in the brief light, they saw her standing at the foot of the stairs, just within reach. "I never left, and neither will you." The coldness of the air grew unbearable, and the team realized they were no longer alone. Something had crossed into the living world with them, and Haida House was alive with the restless spirits that had been waiting for new visitors. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The investigators' panic set in as they tried to get a grasp on the escalating horror around them. The house was no longer a mere building, but an entity alive, breathing, and watching them. The woman at the bottom of the stairs wasn't just a ghost. She felt like something older, more ancient, a part of the house itself. Her black, hollow eyes locked onto Claire with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The moment seemed to stretch, the seconds dragging on endlessly as the footsteps upstairs grew louder, closer, like a parade of unseen horrors coming toward them. Ethan reached for his flashlight, but it flickered out, leaving them in a suffocating darkness. He fumbled for his phone to use as a light source, but the screen remained black, unresponsive. "We need to get out of here," Claire whispered harshly, her voice trembling as she tried to keep calm. But no one responded. The house itself seemed to swallow their words, trapping them in a suffocating silence. The temperature dropped even further. Their breath was visible now, forming clouds of fog in the cold air. With each exhale, it felt like the house was breathing with them. Inhale, exhale, slow and deliberate. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from above, and the whole house trembled as if struck by some unseen force. The investigators looked up, their eyes wide with terror. The sound was followed by a low, guttural growl, something primal, something that did not belong in the world of the living. "It's coming down," Ethan muttered, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Everyone stay close," Claire ordered, trying to keep her composure. But the moment she turned, she caught sight of the woman again, closer now, standing at the foot of the stairs. Her ghostly form was flickering in and out of sight, as though she couldn't decide whether she wanted to be real or part of the house's illusions. But her eyes, those eyes never left Claire's face. There was something about them, something so deep, so empty, it felt like they were drawing her in, pulling her toward the stairs. The growling from above intensified, the sound vibrating through the walls. The floor beneath them began to creak, like it was shifting underfoot. Then, as though in a single moment, every door in the house slammed shut with a deafening bang. The team recoiled in fear as the once familiar structure turned into an unyielding labyrinth, its corridors twisting and stretching like something out of a nightmare. And then, in the silence that followed, the woman spoke again. "You shouldn't have come here." Her voice was soft, almost soothing, but it carried a weight that sent shivers down their spines. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the shadows growing darker around them as the temperature dropped to what felt like sub-zero. The house seemed to be feeding on their fear, amplifying it, making them question what was real and what wasn't. Without warning, the woman's form shimmered and then faded from view, leaving only her whisper to linger in the air. Ethan was the first to react. "We need to find a way out now." The group began to move, desperately searching for an exit. They reached the hallway, but the door they had entered through was now gone, replaced by an old, rusted doorframe. A door they had never seen before stood in its place, unfamiliar, like it had always been there, waiting for them. With no other choice, they pushed through the door, each step weighed down by the oppressive atmosphere of the house. The room they entered was a narrow corridor, dimly lit by flickering lamps on the walls. They hurried forward, every noise amplified in the heavy silence that followed them. Their footsteps echoed like drums, filling the space with an urgency they could not shake. Suddenly, a loud crash from behind made them spin around. The woman was there again, but she was no longer alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, rising from the very walls of the house, their forms indistinct, like people caught in the process of becoming part human and part something else, something far darker. The investigators stumbled backward, their hearts racing in terror. Claire's flashlight flickered again and then died. They were plunged back into the consuming darkness. A voice, now much closer, broke through the blackness. "Leave this place, or be trapped here forever." The words sent an icy wave through them. Something deep within the house was speaking to them, not with words, but with the force of its presence, something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching, for years. The air grew thick again, pressing against their lungs, each breath harder than the last. And then, with a suddenness that took their breath away, the floor beneath them began to crumble. One by one, the investigators lost their footing, slipping into the black abyss below. The world seemed to dissolve around them as they fell, the air rushing past in a violent blur. Ethan's scream was lost in the void, swallowed by the oppressive darkness that had consumed them. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the sensation of falling down, down, into the depths of the house. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the fall stopped. The group found themselves on solid ground again, their bodies bruised and disoriented. Their surroundings were unfamiliar, narrow, damp, and cold. The walls of the chamber seemed to pulse, alive with a strange energy. The faint light that filtered through the cracks in the stone illuminated what appeared to be an underground passage. They stumbled to their feet, shaken and breathing heavily. Claire was the first to regain her composure, wiping the dirt and dust from her clothes. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The others turned to her, the confusion clear on their faces. They were deep beneath the house now, in a part of it they had never seen. The air smelled musty, like long-forgotten secrets hidden away for centuries. "How did we end up here?" Ethan asked, his voice strained, his eyes wide with panic. He shone his flashlight around, but the beam seemed to bounce off the walls, revealing nothing more than shadows. There was no sign of a door, no sign of escape. "We have to keep moving," Claire said, her voice steady but laced with fear. "We need to get out of this place." They walked cautiously, the stone floor cold beneath their feet, the walls feeling unnervingly close, as if the very structure of the house were pressing in on them. The hallway stretched ahead, narrowing into an even darker tunnel, and the air grew colder with each step they took. The faint whispers from before began again, growing louder, more insistent, as though the very earth itself was alive with voices. "I never left." It was the same voice, the same haunting words that had followed them from the house's upper floors. This time, it seemed to come from all around them, surrounding them, closing in on them. "Did you hear that?" Claire stopped in her tracks, eyes darting nervously around the darkened corridor. "Not again," Ethan muttered, looking over his shoulder. His voice cracked slightly, betraying his fear. "Where is it coming from?" From the shadows ahead of them, a figure slowly materialized, its form blurred and indistinct at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. It was the woman again, her face even paler, her eyes black and hollow. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, other shapes appeared, figures that looked like they were made from the walls themselves, growing out of the darkness like ghosts trapped in the very stones of the house. The woman's form stepped forward, her gaze fixed on them with an intensity that chilled them to their bones. She spoke again, her voice no longer a whisper but a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the ground beneath their feet. "Leave now or you will stay forever." Before they could react, the ground beneath them shook. The walls trembled as if something immense was stirring deep below. The air grew thick with an oppressive force, pressing in on them, suffocating them. Suddenly, a shrill, high-pitched noise cut through the air, like metal scraping against metal. The tunnel ahead began to twist and warp, the walls bending inward. The figures that had appeared from the shadows seemed to dissolve, their faces morphing into grotesque forms, their eyes wide with silent screams. "We have to run," Claire shouted, grabbing Ethan's arm. The others followed suit, their footsteps echoing as they scrambled through the crumbling tunnel. But the path seemed endless, stretching further into the abyss, the walls closing in tighter with every step. The air became so thick with the stench of decay that it was hard to breathe. The faint whispers returned, but now they were no longer words, they were cries, shrieks of agony, trapped voices, as if the house had swallowed the souls of those who had come before them. Desperate, Claire searched for any way out. Her eyes darted from side to side, scanning the walls for an opening, anything that could lead them back to the surface. And then she saw it, a narrow gap in the stone, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. "This way," she cried, pointing to the gap. The group rushed toward it, the woman's voice trailing behind them, growing louder and more desperate. "Don't leave me. I never left." Claire pushed forward, her fingers scraping against the jagged stone as she tried to widen the gap enough for them to pass. But as she reached out, she felt something cold and sharp wrap around her wrist, a hand, thin and bony, clutching her with terrifying strength. Her heart stopped. She turned, but there was nothing behind her, nothing to explain the cold grip tightening around her arm. Suddenly, the ground beneath them buckled. The tunnel began to collapse, the ceiling above them crumbling like dust. The air was thick with the sound of stone breaking apart, and the walls closed in with terrifying speed. A loud crash echoed, followed by a deafening silence. The last thing Claire saw before everything went black was the shadow of the woman, standing at the far end of the tunnel, watching them with those hollow, empty eyes. And then darkness consumed them. When Claire regained consciousness, she found herself lying on cold, damp stone. Her head throbbed, and her body ached, but she managed to sit up. The others were beside her, equally disoriented but alive. The tunnel had collapsed, but they were no longer trapped in the darkness. The air was still thick, heavy with a strange energy, but there was no sign of the ghostly woman or the horrific figures from before. They stumbled to their feet, the weight of their experience pressing on them like a suffocating fog. As they made their way out of the remains of the underground passage, the house above them seemed quieter, almost too quiet. The oppressive presence that had haunted them was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. They didn't look back. When they emerged into the light of the early morning, they found themselves outside Haida House, its ominous silhouette looming in the distance. The house seemed unchanged, its windows dark, its doors silent, as though it had never been disturbed. But they knew better. The house had tried to claim them, and in a way it still did. Claire and the others walked away, never speaking of what had happened again. The town of Gainesville would carry on with its rumors and whispers, but Haida House remained, waiting, its ghosts never truly gone. And for those who dared to venture too close, the whispers still echoed in the wind, "I never left." Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.